Romans, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Chapter 4. Burkett notes, in the close of the foregoing chapter, our apostle laid down a positive and peremptory conclusion that a man is justified by faith without the works of the law. In this chapter, he undertakes to confirm the truth of that conclusion by instancing in the patriarch Abraham, the father of the faithful, who did not find justification and acceptance with God by virtue of his circumcision in the flesh, or any other works of obedience performed by him in the law, but by virtue of his faith, which was imputed and accounted to him from righteousness. From which instance of Abraham's justification by faith, the apostle infers the justification of all believers with him. For who doubts but that the children are justified after the same manner that their father was? This being the design and scope of the chapter, let us observe the force of the apostle's argument, verse the first. Verses 1 and 2. What shall we say then, that Abraham our father as pertaining to the flesh hath found? For if Abraham were justified by works, he hath whereof to glory, but not before God. Burkett notes, as if the apostle had said, what shall we say? Shall anyone affirm that Abraham our father found or obtained righteousness by or according to the flesh? That is, by being circumcised in the flesh, or by any works of righteousness which he had done? Surely no, for if Abraham were justified by circumcision or any other works of his own, he hath whereof to glory. That is, ground of boasting in these works, by which he was thus justified. But manifest it is that he had no whereof to boast and glory before God. Therefore he was not justified by circumcision, nor any works of his own. Learn thence that no righteousness of our own, no services we can perform, are sufficient to procure our justification in the sight of God. For if we are justified by our works, it must be by our works either before faith or after faith. Not before faith, for the corruption of nature and man's impotent condition thereby will give check to any such thought. Surely unrighteousness cannot make us righteous, no more than impurity can make us clean, nor do works after faith justify. For then a believer is not justified upon his believing, and faith is not the justifying grace, but only a preparation to those works which justify. Which is contrary to the whole strain of the apostle throughout the epistle, who ascribes justification to faith in the blood of Christ without works. In short, no righteousness of man is perfect. Therefore, no righteousness of man can be justifying. There is nothing that a man doth, but it is defective, and consequently has matter of condemnation in it. Now that which is condemning cannot be justifying. That which falls short of the holiness of the law can never free us from the condemnatory sentence and curse of the law. Now all works after faith fall short of that perfection which the law requireth. Learn, too, that the design of God was to justify us in such a way as to strip us of pride, not of works, lest any man should boast, says the apostle often. We are justified by faith to exclude boasting, which would not have been excluded by the law of works. Verses 3 through 5. For what saith the Scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Now to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, is faith counted for righteousness. Burkett notes, observe here 1, the account which the Scripture gives of Abraham's justification. It was by faith alone. He believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. That is, he firmly believed the promise of God, that he would give him a son, in whom all the families of the earth should be blessed. And by means of this faith, he was reckoned or esteemed righteous before God, and not by means of his works. Observe, too, the apostle's argument to prove that Abraham was justified by faith and not by works. Had he works of perfect holiness, then in strict justice a reward might have been expected by him as a due debt, and not given him in a way of grace and favor. For to him that worketh, that is, with a design and intent to obtain justification by his works, is the reward reckoned not of grace, but of debt. He having performed all that was required in order to his being righteous before God. But to him that worketh not, that is, who worketh not to the intent and end forementioned, namely to procure justification by working, but seeks that in a way of believing, his faith is counted for righteousness. To him that worketh not, but believeth, etc. We must not understand it absolutely, for he that believeth worketh, but after a sort. He is said not to work because he worketh not with a design to stand righteous before God by his works. Again, by him that worketh not, we are not to understand an idle, lazy believer that takes no care of the duties of obedience. No, an idle faith is an ineffectual faith, and can never be a saving faith. But the meaning is, he worketh not in a law sense, to the ends and intention of the first covenant, to make up a righteousness to cover himself by his own working. Being convinced of his utter inability to work out his own righteousness by the law, and seeing all his endeavors to obey the law fall short of righteousness, he is therefore said, in a law sense, not to work, because he doth not work so as to answer the purpose and end of the law, which accepts nothing short of perfect and complete obedience. And whereas it is here said that God justifieth the ungodly, the meaning is such as have been ungodly, not such as continue so. The apostle describes the temper and frame of their hearts and lives before justification, and not after it, as it found them, not as it leaves them. True, Christ justifies the ungodly, yet such as continue ungodly are not justified by him. We must bring credentials from our sanctification to bear witness to the truth of our justification. Verses 6 and 7. Even as David also describeth the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Burkitt notes, observe here that to the example of Abraham, the apostle subjoins the testimony of David, Psalm 32, who describes the blessedness of that man to whom God imputeth righteousness, to wit, the righteousness of the mediator, without any works brought before God to be justified by, saying, Blessed is the man whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered, and iniquity not imputed. Sin, in respect of the offense, is remitted. In respect of the filth or turpitude of it, is covered. In respect of the punishment, not imputed. This heap of words serves only to amplify and set forth the abundant grace of God in the act of pardoning sin. Learn hence, 1, that to pardon sin is God's prerogative. He forgiveth iniquity, and covereth transgression. 2, the pardon of sin is a covering of sin, not such a covering of sin as God cannot see it in a justified person to chastise him for it, but so covered as to not punish him with wrath and condemnation for it. Learn 3, that God's act in pardoning and covering sin is extensive and perfect, full and final. Iniquity, transgression, and sin is forgiven, covered, and not imputed. Learn 4, that transcendent is the blessedness of those whose iniquity is pardoned and their transgressions covered. Blessedness, says the original, belongs to the man whose iniquity is forgiven and whose sin is covered, and to whom the Lord will not impute transgressions. Verses 9 and 10. Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in incircumcision? Not in circumcision, but under uncircumcision. Burkitt notes, here the apostle moves the question, namely, whether the forementioned blessedness of pardon of sin and justification by faith belongs to the circumcised Jews only, or to the uncircumcised Gentiles also, which question carries with it the force of a strong affirmation that seeing faith was imputed to Abraham for righteousness many years before he was circumcised, therefore the uncircumcised Gentiles, as well as the circumcised Jews, shall by faith be made partakers of the same blessedness unto which Abraham was entitled before he was circumcised. Learn hence that God has appointed one and the same way and method for the justification and salvation of all persons, circumcised and uncircumcised, Jews and Gentile, honorable and ignoble, namely, justification by faith in the blood of his Son, without which no church privileges or spiritual prerogatives whatsoever will entitle them to real blessedness. Cometh this blessedness on the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? Abraham believed unto righteousness before he was circumcised. Therefore the Gentiles by faith shall be accounted righteous, even though they never be circumcised. Verses 11 and 12. And he that receiveth the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they not be circumcised, his righteousness might be imputed unto them also. And the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had, being yet uncircumcised. Burkitt notes, here the apostle declares the reason why and the end for which Abraham was circumcised, seeing he was justified by faith in the promised Messiah long before circumcision. He tells us that Abraham received circumcision as a sign and seal of the covenant made with him and to his seed, Genesis 17, and also as an obligation that the righteousness of faith was the true way for a sinner to become righteous, which righteousness Abraham had obtained while he was uncircumcised. That so he might be a father in a spiritual sense of all believers, both Jews and Gentiles, who imitated him in his faith and in the holiness and obedience of his life. Note here 1, the person instituting the sacrament of circumcision, God and not Abraham. He received circumcision. That is, by the appointment of God, he was circumcised. Sacraments must be of divine institution, not of human invention. The Church can make no sacraments. Her duty is with care and caution to administer them. There is a fourfold word requisite to a sacrament: a word of institution, a word of command, a word of promise, and a word of blessing. The elements are ciphers. 'Tis the institution makes them figures. Divine institution is as necessary to a sacrament as a royal inscription is to the current money. Note, too, the nature of sacraments in general, and of circumcision in particular. They are signs and seals. He received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith. The circumcision, 1, was a sign and token of the covenant which God made with Abraham and the Jews. It was a commemorative sign of God's covenant with Abraham, a representative sign of Abraham's faith and obedience towards God, a demonstrative sign of original sin and the depravity of human nature, a discriminating and distinguishing sign of the true church and people of God from all the rest of the world, an initiating sign by which all strangers that were received into the commonwealth of Israel were admitted into the Jewish church. And lastly, it was a prefigurative sign of baptism, which the Christian church was to succeed in the room of circumcision. 2. Circumcision was not a sign only, but a seal also, a seal of the righteousness of faith. It was a seal both on God's part and on Abraham's also. A seal on God's part to confirm all the promises made to Abraham and his seed. 3. A seal both on his and their parts, to bind them to renounce the service of all other gods, and to oblige them to the observation of the whole law. Note lastly, the character and description here given of true believers. They are such as walk in the steps of faithful Abraham. They have not only Abraham to their father, but they walk in the footsteps of their father's faith. As Abraham readily obeyed the call of God, so do they. As Abraham left his idolatrous country and kindred, and though he had the opportunity of returning, yet never returned more, so do the faithful sons and daughters of Abraham leave all known sins, and no temptation can prevail with them to return to the delightful practice of them. Did Abraham break through all impediments, difficulties, and discouragements whatsoever? So do and will all those that tread in the faith of their father Abraham surmount all difficulties, bid defiance to all dangers, that they may yield a ready, cheerful, and persevering obedience to the commands of the God of Abraham. Few of the children of Abraham's flesh, but all the children of his faith, do thus walk in the steps of their renowned father.